Hi, so this is the first video on chapter 6, where we are now shifting truly from talking about behaviorism, again, this idea that the only thing that psychology should be concerned about is what is observable. So what is the observable behavior and what are the observable stimuli and context that was shaping the behavior. And now we're moving towards really appreciating what is going on inside a person's head. And so the first individual that we're going to talk through in this video is Donald Hebb. So just taking a step back, I want to talk about what is Donald Hebb referring to. And what he's saying is that there are higher mental processes. These are thinking or thought processes that come in between the stimulus and the response, and they're mediating. Mediating is a fancy word for well, the root media is in the middle, so you can think of medium. It's in the middle, and so it's in the middle between everything coming into our senses through our eyes, our ears, or our mouth, or our skin, and then we put out some behavior. Higher mental processes are what comes in between that. So what are we thinking, and how are we processing information? And Hebb has a quote: "Everything you know about another person's thoughts or feelings is inferred from behavior. Knowledge of behavior is factual. Knowledge of mental processes is theoretical or inferential." So we are never actually observing what is occurring in a person's mind and what are they thinking about. We're just simply inferring it based on their behaviors. Like, what do they say they are thinking? That's an indirect indicator of what they may be thinking. All right, so a little bit of background about Donald Hebb. So he passed away in 1904 to 1985. Born in Canada, wanted to be a novelist. His parents were physicians. He failed 11th grade with most of his classmates, but finally he earned his PhD from Harvard. Okay, so the thing about Hebb is he is actually, he's a theorist of the nervous system. So according to Hebb, psychology needs to take into account the functioning of the brain, of the nervous system. And other behaviorists really avoided speculation about what does the brain do, what does the spinal cord do. They obviously knew that it was involved in how we respond to our environment, but they didn't want to speculate about what it might actually be doing. But Hebb went there. He was really trying to develop some hypotheses about what might be occurring, and a lot of what he hypothesized before we had, brain scanners, things like that, actually came true. So what he believed was true is actually fairly accurate in terms of how our nervous system works. And so Hebb proposed that mental processes come between stimulus and response, and really should be understood as neurological events. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to do a little bit of a review on the nervous system. So if you've taken brain and behavior, this will again be familiar to you, but I figure I will still cover it because maybe you haven't taken that yet, or maybe you have and you have forgotten some of the things that you learned. So first off, the neuron is the basic level of the brain. It's composed. It's a cell, and it's composed of three major parts: the soma, or the cell body, the dendrites, and then the axon. And the nervous system is basically a chain of these neurons, where they are communicating from the axon of one neuron to the dendrites of another neuron through a space. So they're communicating even though there's still a space in between. And they communicate using chemicals. So they release neurotransmitters, including dopamine, serotonin, acetylcholine, norepinephrine, and there's a few others. All right, so this is not the greatest picture, but this is from the textbook where they sort of represent neurons. So here is neuron 1, here's neuron 2. You can see, oops, the B is pointing to the cell body, so that's the body of the cell. And then you have the A pointing to dendrites and C pointing to the axon. Then there's a space in between one neuron and another neuron. You can see it right here. And then the next neuron, obviously it has a cell body, it has the dendrites, and then it has an axon. So Hebb argued that repeated transmission of impulses between two neurons leads to permanent facilitation of transmission between these cells. All right, if you don't understand that, then he has a quote that makes it a little bit more simplified. Neurons that fire together wire together. So neurons that are close to each other and that fire at the same time will gradually wire together. They'll form synapses. There'll be greater connectivity between those two neurons. Again, all it takes is for them to fire together and they will wire together. So that's the first assumption. The second assumption is that neurons fire in a circular pattern. And so that the original neuron is eventually reactivated by another neuron in the pattern. I'll show you in a second what this can look like. And then finally, simultaneous active cell assemblies become associated so that they can activate each other mutually. And again, I'll unpack what that means. Sorry, I just have to. Okay, so here's a graphic representing the cell assembly. So you could see here that these are a bunch of neurons that are wired together into a circuit, and it's an ordered firing. So there's a pattern in regards to the connections between it. And then you could see they form a circle. And so this is this idea that they come together and form a pattern that can keep something in mind for at least a period of time. And these cell assemblies correspond to relatively simple input. So if you're looking at a person, you would have a cell assembly for their nose, their glasses, their ears, etc. And so these are the ways that your brain, in a sense, knows that you are looking at a nose, and knows that you're looking at an ear, because your brain will have these neurons that are attuned to respond to certain visual input, and then they start to say, oh, I know what that is, that's an ear. Of course, there's no being in your mind that says, oh, I know what that is, but your brain is doing this process and understanding stimuli as all coming together. And then here is a phase sequence. So this is one step more complicated from a cell assembly. Phase sequence is a series of cell assemblies. So here is a cell assembly, here is a cell assembly, here's a cell assembly. And a phase sequence is basically like a concept or a composite of something. So you have a phase sequence that helps you understand, oh, that is grandma, right? You've got a nose cell assembly, an eye cell assembly, something that sort of detects that she's wearing a certain type of clothes. And then all that comes together into a phase sequence where you're now understanding this person in the whole. Okay, well, it's not always about a person. It could also be a concept. So you can say, oh, That's that's golden fur. That's a wagging tail. That's a ears that are sticking up, and be like, oh, that's a golden retriever. So so that's more of a concept, and again, that's how your brain is wired to be able to process things. And the cell assembly and phase sequence come together because of the first principle, which is that neurons that fire together wire together. Again, that's the whole basis of Hebb's physiological theory. Is he says that things that occur at the same time are going to get wired together. So you will see golden fur and a wagging tail, that those co-occur. So you've got neurons that say, oh, that's a golden fur, oh, that's a wagging tail, and then they put it together and say, oh, that's a golden retriever. And because you see golden retrievers with those kind of characteristics at the same time, those neurons, those cell assemblies fire at the same time, and again, they get worked together into this phase sequence. Let me give another example. So you see a person that you recognize. You'll see their nose, their ears, their mouth, their eyes, all of those characteristics. And again, those are cell assemblies. And then because that person has those eyes, has those ears, has that nose, that mouth, and all of them occur at the same time, right? You see their face as a whole. All those cell assemblies are firing. And again, that's how they all get wired together, because at the same moment that you're seeing their nose, you're seeing their eyes. So you start to, essentially form a representation of their whole face. And for Hebb, higher mental processes involve activity in neural assemblies. So again, this is where neurons arrange in such a way that they can reactivate one another in patterns he calls cell assemblies. So one of these real critical questions: how do we keep something in mind? How do we have a grocery list and keep it in mind so that we can keep thinking about, oh, I need to get the bananas. I need to get the bananas. Well, there has to be some neurological phenomenon that allows us to basically think of a banana, think of all the characteristics, think about why I need a banana, but then also reactivate it and keep it in mind. And so that's what Hebb is trying to do with this idea. And this idea of cell assemblies is actually helping guide computer representations, neural networks that tell us about how our psychology actually work. And so that's been an interesting application. And one of the things that we know about we know about, or a lot of our understanding about, sorry about that, I'm taking the microphone off. So a lot of what we know about the neural processes, originally we learned about it from the Aplysia. The Aplysia is a slug-like snail, and it only has a few neurons. So it's really easy to study with neurological studies. And what we know is that if you touch it, if you ever see like a sea anemone, you would know that you touch a sea anemone, I can barely pronounce it, and it contracts. And the Aplysia has the same property. It retracts its gills when it is touched. And each time you touch it, the retraction is less. So when we talk about habituation, this was actually our first understanding of habituation. And that is that, again, if you do something repeatedly, oftentimes it leads to less of a response. And but then there was another process called sensitization. So sometimes when you if you were able to overwhelm the Aplysia with something really powerful, like an electric shock, then instead of repeated touches leading to less and less response, you can you can do repeated touches, and it, of course, habituates, but then you shock it and then touch it again. And it's like, we would say, oh, it's keyed up now. It's worried about another shock. Obviously, the aplesia is not, doesn't have a complex enough nervous system to make that sort of judgment, but it's sensitized. It responds more strongly to the repeated touch after that electric shock's been given. And so a lot of what we think occurs in the brain, the human brain, is a process of habituation and sensitization. So generally, we will habituate to most things. That's our default, is that if we see something, again, it could be a person's face, it could be reading about something or watching something in the news, we can become habituated to it. But sometimes there's a process that allows us to wake up. So if we're overwhelmed with something, then we are sensitized to it. So even though we're hearing, I'm recording this in the middle of the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, even though we're hearing a lot about that, we're sensitized to it. We're more attuned to it because it's like an electric shock each time we hear about it. We feel like it's shocking us into awareness, and we want to hear more and hear more. So instead of habituating, even though we hear things over and over and over again, we're actually sensitized to it. And if you just think from an evolutionary perspective, that would make sense. You would want to habituate to things that are boring and unuseful to you, but you want to sensitize to things that, a shock or something that could potentially harm you, you want to pay attention to it. So that's why we're paying attention to the pandemic. We recognize, oh, this could potentially harm us or harm someone that we care about. So this is an illustration that shows that our nervous system is, we have a capacity of reactivity and plasticity. So we can react to external stimuli, right? So we sense things and we react to things. We're always doing this. But it also shows plasticity. So it's this idea that our behavior and our nervous system changes as a result of repeated stimulation and repeated exposure to any sensory information. So what happens with plasticity, again, when people think about plasticity, they often think about, oh, that's how you can recover from after brain damage. Well, plasticity does refer to that, but it refers to a lot more. So it refers to the fact that if we don't use something in our brain, if we have neural connections that we're not thinking about, we're not activating, they're generally going to disappear. And we also know that plasticity means that our brain will become potentiated or depressed. Now, that long-term depression doesn't refer to clinical depression. It just means that our neurons will be less likely to fire. So our brain has the capacity to become potentiated, so more likely to fire in response to stimuli, and it has the capacity for long-term depression or decreased likelihood to fire in response to the environment and the stimuli. And so that's the basics of our brain, where our brain is incredibly plastic. It's never the same. Our brain is always changing, and it's adapting to the environment around us. Okay, so just think about all the things that you don't pay attention to on a daily basis. I'm wearing a shirt. I don't pay attention to the texture and the feel of the shirt most of the time. I know that it, occasionally I might feel an itch or I might become aware of it, but generally I habituate to it. I don't pay attention to my shirt because my shirt doesn't matter. But I also have a process where if it's if a part of my shirt is scratching me enough that it's starting to hurt, I will now be sensitized to it. So just wearing this shirt, it shows habituation because I stop paying attention to it. I don't notice it, but then sometimes I become sensitized to it, and I, if it's scratching me, I'm like, oh, okay, I should probably, move my shirt and adjust it so that I don't get a rash or anything. And this is really what separates us from machines. Machines don't change with experience. They're obviously, they can get worn down, things like that, but the very structure of the machine doesn't change with experience. So if you think about a computer, the hardware doesn't really change. Again, it may wear down, but it's not the hardware doesn't adapt to the world around it. And that's really an important part. When we think about humans, we cannot just say, oh, we're just processing and outputting information. That's what Descartes said, that we're sort of a hydraulic system. But no, what we're realizing is that we have some parallels to machines and computers, but there's some real differences as well. That the capacity for our hardware, our brain, our body to change in response to the world around us is unique and is something that separates us from these machines. And but it also just presents a challenge to the classical conditioning paradigm of stimulus response. So this idea of stimulus response is that, it doesn't matter what happens in between there. It's just an automatic process that our brain does that will, again, if you're talking about classical conditioning, we've got an automatic response to a unconditioned stimulus. And so the automatic response is the unconditioned response. And then you have the conditioned stimulus. And the idea of the conditioned stimulus is that you sort of transfer that reflex. Well, we don't have biology that just can transfer a reflex. Our biology is about these cycles and these cell assemblies and phase sequences. And so if you think about it that way, I mean, it just has some implications for how we understand classical conditioning. It's a process that gets put together in our mind with representations and so it's a little bit more complicated, and our psychology should represent that complication well. So again, higher mental processes are these phase sequences. So I already mentioned this, that if two cell assemblies are repeatedly active at the same time, an association between the two will tend to form. Now, if you think about classical conditioning, this explains it. So if you take a bell, you ring a bell, and then you have the smell and taste of food at the same time. Well, there's a cell assembly. Oh, there's a bell ringing. Oh, there's a cell assembly for the taste and texture of the food. Well, they're firing at the same time. So what is happening, according to Hebb, is that the cell assembly for the bell, the sound of the bell, and the cell assembly for the food are firing at the same time. What's going to happen? Well, they're going to get wired together because the neurons that fire together wire together. So the reason why the classical conditioning occurs is because our brains are getting wired together so that the stimuli are getting wired together. And as a result, it leads to, the bell leads to the activation of the taste and texture of the food, which leads to the activation of the salivation. So after an association has been formed, our brain can fill in the gaps. So if I see half of my face, well, obviously it's my face, but if I see half of someone else's face, I can still identify who they are. Our brain has that capacity. So to think about classical conditioning, you think about it as, okay, our brain is filling in the details and says, oh, I hear the bell. I know it's going to be coming. The food is going to be coming. We're filling in the gaps with our cognitive ability. So essentially what Hebb is doing is he's reframing classical conditioning to talk about it in a biological manner. So instead of it being just this US and CS that elicits a conditioned response, no, it's that our brains have wired together. In doing so, they co-activate and they activate these whole phase sequences, including the like salivation response or whatever unconditioned responses associated with that neutral, not neutral, the unconditioned stimulus. So I think another example for Barack Obama, when we think about Barack Obama, it brings up other ideas and memories. So you think about, oh, former president, think about Michelle, think about Democrat, African American, and a whole host of other cell assemblies. And so we are, this is something we know about our memory, is that it's all sort of connected. We learned that all these things are associated because we experience them together, right? Neurons that fire together wire together. So we hear about Barack and Michelle, we hear about Obama as a Democrat, because we hear those together, they're co-activated, they're activated at the same time, they get wired together. Higher mental processes are all about forming associations. We form associations between stimuli that are perceived together. Again, the nose and the ear. We form associations between stimuli and behavior. So when I hear a bell, I might salivate, and again, that provides a biological explanation for classical conditioning. All right, well, I already talked about this, but again, Pavlov's experiment could be explained as there's a cell assembly for a bell becomes activated. Well, then the cell assembly for food became activated. Food was already connected to the cell assembly that involves salivation. So when this recurred many times, the cell assemblies became a phase sequence due to the principle that neurons that fire together wire together. Now the bell could activate salivation. And more specifically, the cell assembly for the bell could activate the cell assembly for food, which activates the cell assembly for salivation. So just to pause for a second, I don't know about you, but I like this idea. I feel like it explains a lot about human behavior. Instead of talking about it in US and CS, this is what I'm more inclined to. I like this explanation better. It's like, yeah, classical conditioning means that we connect things together in our brain with our neurons, and that is leading to these sort of responses to them. So if you talk about phobias, right, we have snakes, the visual impact of a snake itself isn't automatically something that leads us to feel fear, but we connect it with the fangs coming at us, or the idea of poison, and those other things are what we connect to fear. But because the snake is combined with the fangs that are coming striking at our striking at us, as a result of that, we have fear associated with snakes. Okay, so for higher mental processes, again, I'm finding I talk about this stuff before I have my slide. So how do I remember to buy milk? Well, if you think about it as simple stimulus response, it's hard to explain. When I go to the store, why do I buy milk when I know that we're missing, that we ran out of milk, but it was days or hours earlier? Well, this is where higher mental processes explain so much more than classical conditioning and operant conditioning. I buy milk because I have the capacity to remember. I can remember the empty milk carton, and even though it was perceived hours or days earlier, I know that it's that it needs to be purchased. So higher mental processes are cognitive events that mediate responses. So it's not stimulus response, it's stimulus higher mental processes response. So it is something in between that is really important. There are some things that you could just ignore, the higher mental process, right? Those automatic classical conditioning behaviors. But most of our behaviors, we have to really appreciate that there's something occurring in between stimulus and response, where we're perceiving, we're categorizing, we're remembering, we're doing organizing of our mental life, and all that's very important. And Hebb, to kind of return to his theory, he also pointed out that attention and set are important. Attention refers to selectivity among input, and set refers to selectivity among responses. Okay, so what does that mean? So when we are ready to, there's certain situations where our certain cell assemblies can be pre-activated. Okay, when I am in church, just the nature of it is I'm more likely to be thinking about God and Christ and faith and ideas from Christianity. I have cell assemblies that are already activated as soon as I walk into the church. So attention refers to this idea that I'm going to be more attuned and ready to hear about grace when I'm in church than I would be if I'm at the grocery store. If I hear about grace, I'm going to be, oh yeah, I know what that is, but I'm just not going to be ready. So attention is that we tend to be kind of selective about the stimuli that we hear and see and taste and touch. So it's about our sensations. Sometimes we pay more attention to certain stimuli than to others. Set is similar, except it's not about what do we sense and perceive. It's about how do we behave. So there are certain circumstances where my behavior is more likely to be a certain way. So if I'm driving, I might be more likely to, yell at a person. They can't hear me. I'm going to yell at them for cutting me off. But if I was at, again, the grocery store, I would be less likely, if someone cuts me off, to yell at them. That's not a behavior I tend to use in grocery stores. And so again, that because it's not pre-activated, I'm not ready to behave that way. So attention and set. Attention is you're ready to perceive certain things. Set is you're ready to behave certain ways. And how we perceive and how we learn depends on what cell assemblies have already been activated. So again, if you're not attuned to a bell, then if you've been listening to the TV and you're trying to pay attention to the TV, you may hear a bell, but because your attention has been fixated on the TV, you may not actually hear the bell. Even though the physical characteristics, you can hear it, you just won't, it won't be processed at the same level. And so, again, when we're talking about behaviorism, they're not really appreciating that the organism matters. Sometimes if it's just stimuli and response, well, who's to say that we're going to pay attention to the stimuli? And who's to say that we're ready to behave in a certain way? Well, that's what Hebb is trying to say here. So how do you take, what are the educational applications? Well, he talks about arousal, and basically you need to have in the middle arousal. If you have too high of an arousal level, your attention is too narrow and you're likely to become anxious or panicked. So if you're really worked up and you're like, oh, I've got a test today. Well, some people become so worked up that they become anxious and actually leads them to their attention's too narrow. They don't keep their eyes open and ears open to everything going on around them, and their behavior becomes narrow. They focus on their anxiety. They respond only with anxiety. When if it's a test, well, what behavior you need is, well, you need to work out the problem. So, and then the opposite, too low of arousal can be a problem. Attention's not focused, and the student may feel lethargy or sleepiness, and this can occur if material seems irrelevant. So if you apply this to the classroom setting, you want to keep students in that moderate level of arousal. Arousal, again, it's kind of like anxiety, but it also includes wakefulness and being alert. And so you want to keep them in moderate alertness. You don't want them getting so riled up that they can't focus. And you also don't want them so bored out of their mind that they're not going to be able to, pay attention to anything. If you apply this to clinical work, to therapy, so again, it's a little bit of just a reframing of classical and operant conditioning. You're basically thinking about behavior, problematic behaviors, is you're trying to form new patterns of neuronal firing. And so what therapy can actually do is you can get people to imagine. You can get them to imagine circumstances, or there's a technique called the empty chair technique, where you have an empty chair and they talk to someone they have an issue with, and they get to play it out, and it engages their imagination. But what's happening? It's higher mental processes. They're thinking about that person, and by engaging with this imaginary person, well, they're a real person, but just not there. You get them to sort of reorganize their brain a little bit. And what Hebb would say is, when you imagine it happening, it is happening. It's happening in the brain. And I think that's kind of an interesting way of thinking about some clinical work. Last slide for Hebb. So it's just sort of an appraisal of Hebb's theory. Again, it's a pretty significant departure from stimulus response theories, because it's really concerned with neurological events with the brain. And his work on arousal theory, we're going to talk about motivation later in the textbook in this course. And so we'll talk about Hebb again when we talk about motivation. And then finally, his work on sensory deprivation had an important influence on research and learning. So Hebb was very influential. Even though you may not have heard about him, I hope after this class you take away that phrase, that neurons that fire together wire together. Okay, we'll end here.